So what we've been doing is exploring this booklet that's just been reprinted, nice little book market, Breaking Through into Buddhahood. I won't recap what I said last week because you can watch me on YouTube. It always seems comical. Anyway, you can. So then that tells you, that'll go through everything we looked at last week. Part of the reason I wanted to do this series on this booklet was because of the experience that I had on the basis of listening to this lecture when I was 25, I think, which I talked about. But also I wanted to introduce you to my own teacher, to our teacher, to the teacher of the Triratna Buddhist order, Bhante Urgyen Sangharakshita. And these little books are a very good introduction to him. There's his lecture and then there's seminar extracts, because a lot of Bhante's teaching was mainly just sitting in a room with a group of people and just talking to them. Most of Bhante's teaching is like that. So there's some extracts from seminars. And Padmavajra has written this lovely little essay about what it was like being on seminar with Bhante. I knew Bhante reasonably well, but I was never in a seminar with him. He wasn't really teaching by the time I came along. So you get a bit of an insight into Bhante as a teacher. Unfortunately, I okayed the bookshop to put them out earlier on in the week, and they've all been sold again. So things are going terribly well. But we'll have more of them next week. Yeah. But it is a nice, lovely little sort of short introduction to Bhante. Yes, and we've just published we just completed his complete works, which is, like a shelf that wide, and they're huge tome-like books, which I don't think anyone's going to be carrying on the tube. So it's quite good to have these little small things you can stick in your pocket. Yeah. Okay, I wanted to say something about a little sort of corrective, or not quite a corrective, but a bit more about what I said last week. I said, rather facetiously, that I wanted to bring stress back into meditation. And I stand by that, or I sit by that. Somebody even said to me, "Oh, you're the stress guru." But yeah, I want to bring stress back into meditation. So by that, just in case it's not clear, what I mean by stress in meditation, and I talked about a lot last week, so I won't go about it too much, is this great matter of the kind of effort you need to make in meditation. I say you, I mean me, I mean every meditator since the Buddha's enlightenment 2,500 years ago. You do, and I do, need to make an effort. There's no way around that, unfortunately. There's lots of people on YouTube at the moment teaching you non-duality, Advaita Vedanta, all these things. And one of the reasons why they're so popular is because they don't stress effort. They don't ask you really to make an effort. In fact, often they'll say that there's no way to the goal. This is very, very appealing, but it's untrue and unhelpful. Yeah, you do have to make an effort. You sort of know that, really. Even getting yourself to meditate is an effort. In fact, often enough, that's the biggest effort, isn't it? It's getting yourself to sit down and actually do the thing. So the whole language of non-effort is highly rhetorical, very attractive, but wrong. Yeah. So there. So the reason why people try to talk about that you don't need to make an effort, which I do think is a bit scandalous, especially any Buddhist teacher teaching that, is because it is genuinely a question, an art about how you make effort and what effort means in meditation. It's actually a very deep matter what effort means in meditation. It's nothing remotely like pushing a car, but neither is it merely blobbing out. And a lot of what you're learning in meditation is how to make right effort, what effort actually means in meditation. My own hunch, as I say, I'm writing a book at the moment with Jan Archer, my own hunch is that we westernized people, I use westernized rather than Western nowadays, because westernized is increasingly the whole world. We westernized people either force it or fake it. we don't have a very good relationship to effort. So we either just try and make something happen, which Sangharakshita calls willfulness. But by willfulness, he means like the willfulness of a child that just wants something. Yeah, that's what he means by willfulness. He doesn't mean it's not a criticism of willpower, you need that. He means willfulness, like a child just trying to grab something it wants, and nothing will stop it, even if it's not a good idea. Yeah. So we either sort of willfully just try and get something we want, deep meditation experiences, whatever it is nowadays that people want, or we sort of pretend that we've got it. And a lot of the teaching that I've noticed online, it's sort of really pretend that you've got it. Actually, the great matter is how you make effort, because you can overdo it in a narrow, overly goal-focused way. Actually, having a goal is perfectly healthy. There's been too much loose talk about not having one. It's perfectly healthy to have a goal, but yes, you can meditate with an overly goal-orientated attitude, which is basically too narrow, doesn't take enough of your experience in. It's often a bit technical, and it can become pure force and even quite unhealthy. So you can understand if you've gone that route, you'll want to sort of criticize effort. Yeah. But what often happens, people go that route, get fed up with that, and then either give up meditation altogether or go to do a practice like just sitting. In other words, a practice that doesn't imply effort. And usually that doesn't get anywhere. I say this because I did that. So when I was ordained particularly, I took up a particular practice of sadhana. And looking back on it, I spent quite a few years making quite a strong effort. Some of it was fine, but I think it went too far and was a bit too narrow and was a bit too literal. And then I kind of gave up on that practice, and I just sat from then on. And looking back on it, that wasn't any better. I just sort of wool gathered. Yeah? And people often flip between one and the other. They either push too hard, or they just sort of blob out and wool gather. And one is a reaction to the other. So if you wool gather for a bit, you think this is just a waste of time. Then you read some groovy book on meditation, and then you start making an effort again, and you usually overdo that, and then you think, this is no fun, so you go back to wool gathering again. And I've known people do that for years, yeah. It's very easy to then finally give up on meditation altogether. Actually, the whole matter of making an effort, my metaphor of bringing stress back into meditation, because I think we too quickly say, turn towards your experience. I think we're over-teaching that, to be frank. I think we're over-teaching need to be gentle to yourself. Often that's the last thing you need to do. I think we're over-teaching feel, where sometimes we need much more of a sense of volition. It's just, partly those are just cultural tendencies that sort of get all mixed up with Buddhism, yeah, and Buddhist meditation. But it is, the question of finding effort is a lifelong question. When you do find the effort, it's quite glorious. But of course, right effort is never something that you find and then you can switch on to right effort every time you meditate, like, tick, right effort, you find it, then you lose it, and you find it again, and then you refine it, and then you lose it again, and then you overdo it, then you underdo it. And you're constantly trying to work with effort. It's a lifetime's work. At the moment, I'm doing relatively well. Thank you. You need to know that. So that's partly what I mean by bringing the stress back into meditation, is valuing effort and not having this sort of idea that you don't need to make an effort. That's just rhetoric and won't get you anywhere. Even sometimes, I'm afraid, Buddhist rhetoric. But really, when I was thinking about this more, when it comes to bringing the stress back into meditation, the main thing really is actually meditating, by which I mean meditating every day. Yeah. The biggest effort you probably make, and I'm looking at various people in the room. Anyway, no, okay, stand up, those who don't go. We'll publicly humiliate you. The biggest effort you need to make, and I need to make, usually is getting out of bed. You know that soft thing with like a fluffy stuff on? With, in my case, a penguin blanket. It's actually thrusting that off, getting out of bed, so you actually like meditate, yeah? that's usually the biggest stress you need. That's usually the biggest effort you need to make. I need to make, all of us need to make, and make that every day. Yeah? Rather than wake up and think, I don't think, and then, but, so that's the main way to bring stress back into meditation, is actually do it, actually get up. And that's usually the biggest effort you need to make. And one of the issues with meditation is we need to get into the habit of making that effort. It's much, much easier to do that if you do that. If you do that every day and that just becomes part of your life, which is quite a big thing to set into your life, becomes not easy, but it becomes much easier to do it. The more you give yourself days off, the more that breaks down very, very quickly. I do intermittent fasting. I fast most Mondays and Fridays and have done for years. And I didn't do it today for various reasons. You don't need to know about my life, do you? Why have you wanted to know this? Anyway, but the more I don't do it on those days, the more difficult it is to do it. I just sort of think, you can always start to find a good reason not to do your intermittent fasting. So the big effort is to do it, and you'll find it easy to do it if you do it. Yeah? And there's a certain circle in that. Anyway, I'll leave you with that. Then I think the next effort, the next stress I think I want to suggest to people is to meditate for longer. Yeah? Now don't force yourself to meditate for longer, because that will just you'll just get a kickback. But most of us, my guess is, aren't meditating for long enough at a particular set. I think my theory, and do tell me in the tea break that I'm wrong, my theory is that our modern westernized life is now so complicated and so abstracted and screen-based, it takes longer to settle, just basically settle, and know that you're actually meditating. It's just more, there's just more stuff, isn't there, running through your mind. We're dazed by information nowadays. As I've been saying, we have this drive through life where we're just producing ourselves all the time, for Instagram or whatever it is, and just dazed by the information glut that's coming our way. And it just takes more time to settle. So see if you can, let yourself, especially if you've got into the meditation, let yourself meditate for longer. Don't get up so quick. Sometimes we meditate here, those of us who live on the premises meditate here in the shrine room. And it's quite noticeable sometimes, you ring the bell, and sometimes you feel that people are sitting on a spring, and that as soon as you hit the bell, everyone sort of gets up, But and that's fine. But if you imagine, an artist would never do that. You wouldn't be painting a picture, Frank Arbach, who died, didn't he, last week? He would have just been painting a picture and someone rings, ding, 50 minutes. And he goes, that's what I'm doing. You'd be unthinkable. Just brushes down. And meditation is much more like an art than anything else. It's not much more like an art than it is like a religion. But an artist would never have a 50-minute chunk and then you ring the bell and they get up. Yeah. Of course, you don't want to force it being longer and so on, but that's another matter. And then the other thing is to meditate every day. See if you can meditate a bit longer. See if you can come regularly to classes. Because the discipline of meditation, the stress, as it were, as I'm using that language of meditation, is difficult to set up, and because effort is a mysterious matter, it's really mysterious what effort is in meditation. Even the word is a metaphor. It's not, we translate the word into like we need an effort to open a locked door, and then we think that meditation is an effort like that. It's a metaphor, and you have to learn what that metaphor means in meditation. And that's quite a nuanced and flexible and changeable thing you need to learn. Yeah. Because of all that, you need to have regular input and be meditating with others regularly. So what we usually suggest is choose a class you come to the LBC and just come whether you want to or not. Just to support you in your practice. Yeah. Nearly everyone needs that. I've always needed that, and I still need that. And then go on retreats regularly. That's another thing we need to sort of make the effort to do, is go on retreats regularly. We've got all these retreats over Christmas and the New Year. I'm not going on them. Anyway, I'll be at home smoking, watching Netflix, we sherry. I won't actually, I'll be doing very religious things. Yeah, but go on retreat and go regularly on retreat. Yeah, I've been going on regularly on retreat since whatever it was, 1985 when I first got involved. Yeah, you need to go regularly on retreats. So if you go regularly on retreats and you meditate daily, and you come regularly to the classes, and you're working with your effort, your meditations will bear fruit. Yeah? They might not bear fruit in the way you think they will. Meditation is a deeply mysterious, endless thing that you never get to the bottom of, in my experience. I'm still fascinated by it after all this time. And it's still opening up in ways that I didn't imagine. But that's really what I meant last week by bringing the stress back into meditation, to actually get up, which is the biggest stress in my experience. I have to be lured by a cup of tea and some poetry. That's the only way I'll do it. Come to the centre regularly, see if you can meditate for a bit longer, and go on retreats regularly. That's just your basic kind of meditation diet before we add on anything else. Yeah? So I thought what we'd do is, again, let's get together in groups 3 or 4, something like that. And I thought you could just tell each other how you're getting on in meditation, how you're getting on with those things. Are you going on retreat regularly? Are you meditating regularly? Are you getting up to meditate, etc., etc.? Usually, my experience is if I don't get up to meditate, I don't meditate. You know, you always say, oh, I'll do it later on, and almost inevitably I don't. I don't know whether you're the same, but most people seem to find if they don't do it first thing, they don't do it. Some people do. Jan of Arch is very good like that. He'll get up, do stuff, and then meditate middle of the day sometimes. I've never managed that. I sort of think, no, the day has already started, and I've missed the train. Yeah. So have a little group and talk about whether you're doing, how you're getting on basically with meditation. If you're new to meditation, what are you looking for in meditation, and what's brought you to meditation? Yeah, and perhaps introduce yourselves as well. Okay, so in a minute I want to explore breaking through psychological conditioning, which is the second area that Bhante Sangharakshita talks about in his lecture. It's interesting as well, in his lecture he mentions the need to be violent to yourself. He uses very extreme kind of language, which is why I wanted to say that we need to bring stress back into meditation. But I might touch on what he means by that at some point. But for now, I thought what it would be good to start, because rather than me telling you what I think about breaking through psychological conditioning, which I will do, I thought it'd be good for you we'll do a little bit in pairs again, and just perhaps talk in pairs, well, what would that mean to you? You know, if someone said you need to break through psychological conditioning, what would that mean to you? What would you get from that idea? And then, so let's see what you think, as it were, before we then start to explore that. Yeah, what would breaking through psychological conditioning look like to you? Is it an attractive idea? Is it not an attractive idea? What would it look like to you? And then perhaps turn to someone that you haven't yet talked to, if you can. You know, so turn the other way or whatever, and just do it in pairs, yeah, or threes. I want to try and talk about. Sure, these subjects are so sort of large, aren't they? What is psychology, for a start off, and what is breaking through it, and so on. The first thing I wanted to start with is something that I want to explore actually a bit more next week, because it needs a lot of sort of thought, which is that you won't be able to break through psychological conditioning, you won't be able to break through negative emotion, unless you have a transcendental vision. There needs to be something really worth doing that's beyond psychological conditioning and beyond negative emotion. There needs to be something to do with life, yeah? All of us, we need a transcendental perspective. We need what used to be called the divine. Of course, we've sort of decided to ditch the divine around 1853, I think, when Nietzsche said that God is dead and we have killed him, yeah? By which he simply meant you just can't believe in him anymore. So we're some of the first generations, modern westernized people, who have lived or tried to live without a sense of the divine. In other words, without, shall we say, this is why I need now to most next week, but without a something, which isn't a something, which is beyond yourself, beyond, above yourself even, which you can serve and feel in connection with, and which gives your life meaning and purpose. Yeah. I mean, it's weird to have to describe it because human beings until very recently have taken that for granted, that is the background to life. We're the first generations ever not to do that, and it's not been a great success. Yeah? I mean, it really has not been a great success. When Nietzsche said that God is dead and you have killed him, I think in 1853, something like that, he didn't mean that sort of triumphantly. He just said, look, we're in this really deep problem now. We've got the basis of our morality we don't believe in anymore. Even when we think we do, we don't really. But we've based all our morality on that. And he said what will happen is that you'll get this collapse, this moral entropy, and you'll get nihilism as a result. And one of Nietzsche's great attempts in his philosophical life, which was in a way fairly short, was to try to find a new way of creating a believable transcendence, if you could say. So we've now lived without it for quite a fairly long time, and what we're seeing is not a growth in health and strength and vitality and individuality. What we're seeing is a catastrophic breakdown of mental health. Gen Z, has anyone here in Gen Z? Hands up. Oh, not many, that's worrying. Anyway, well, don't worry, folks, because they're the most unhealthy generation that's ever lived. I mean, Patrick's a marvel of Gen Z, but mostly speaking, apart from Patrick, they're really unhealthy. Yeah? They're actually, Gen Z are actually more unhealthy than any previous generation in report, despite the fact that they have all these mental health attempts and so on, despite the fact of liberal parenting and so on. Actually, mental health is going down. Yeah? Now, nobody quite knows why, and it'll be discussed until the next thing happens. But one of the things that a lot of commentators are talking about is a lack of transcendent meaning, the lack of something that life is for. The psychologist Carl Jung, he said, we have fallen from the roof of the medieval cathedral into the abyss of self, which I think is a brilliant way of putting our modern position. We've fallen from the roof of the medieval cathedral into the abyss of self. You know, if we're not careful, we're just serving ourselves, turning ourselves into a church. And that looks good at first. Well, it depends who you ask, but it looks good at first, and it soon becomes really unhealthy. So if we're going to break through negative emotion, if we're going to break through psychological conditioning, we need something that goes beyond that. We can't really be expected to think of breaking through psychological conditioning if that's all we think we've got. Yeah, why there's nothing to break through into. To break through into something, to break through something suggests there's something the other side of that. Yeah. So, but I'll talk about that more next week. But basically, to take up a Dharma life, to take up any kind of discipline in the best sense, you need something that's worth doing it for. You know, I was just mentioning Arbak, the painter that died last week, wonderful painter. He just painted every day of his life apart from Christmas Day. A friend of mine knew his son, and he would just paint every day. That's all he did. You know, that's what artists do, genuine artists do, because there's something really worth doing, and they'll shape the whole of their life around that one thing that's really worth doing. You see, I was reading about Matisse a while ago, and the same is true of him. In fact, his doctor had to give him hours in the studio because he would just work himself to death. Basically, you need this sense that there's something really worth doing, and to do that, I'll not do these things. I'll not get into negative mental states from last week, and I'll break through or work with or whatever we need to do with our psychological conditioning, because there's something much more interesting at stake. Yeah? And I think that's the thing we've lost. is a sense that there's something beyond. Last week I was talking about identity, I was talking about diagnosis. We've lost that there's something beyond that. So we're in the abyss of self, trying to make self work. And self doesn't work unless we have a transcendental basis, unless we can find a way back to what we used to call the divine. I've never believed in God, and I think Nietzsche was right. I think you can't actually now, even if you think you can. I think the metaphor has died, but that doesn't mean to say it wasn't getting at something. Yeah, it doesn't mean to say that it was just all a kind of. That people talk about religion as if it's all been listed terrible hoax from these awful people who've just sold a lie. It's just not true. The reason why religion has been so important is because human beings feel themselves to be part of something infinitely greater. They used to call that God or the divine or the host of angels. Then we got rid of all that and said, oh, that's all so silly. And we've made ourselves very, very unhappy as a consequence. So that's my first thing I want to say, is that to break through psychological conditioning, we need to find a way back to the divine without creating God, because I just don't think we can do that. And it's just not true. There's no essences. And as soon as you make anything to an essence, you've kind of, from the Buddhist point of view, you've made a wrong step. And that will lead you to more and more wrong steps. Yeah? God is making a bit of a comeback at the moment, and I'm determined to push him back. Lovely guy, don't get me wrong. But he is making a little bit of a quiet comeback. Especially, it's interesting, a lot of philosophers are more and more like theologians. In fact, I was listening to a philosopher and he was saying that actually the best thinking seems to be from theologians just now, partly because they've been thinking outside of the box and therefore got much more interesting things to say. But the try to bring God back won't work. Okay. I hope he's listening. Okay. So the Buddhist view of psychology is something like this, that psyche has got three basic layers. Yeah? You could put it this way at least in a rough and ready way, which is you've got your psychology, that your mind is structured by your psychology, and that's in itself quite a complex thing. It's to do with all sorts of factors, from genes to epigenetics to social and cultural factors to, I think, archetypal factors, the sort of things that Jung would have talked about. So you've got this layer of psychology. Above that, you've got spirituality, which in Buddhism is thought of particularly the dhyanas, the states of mind that are supraconscious, that you can access in meditation, where they're blissful, one-pointed. When you touch into the dhyanas, and you know, it's everything you've ever wanted. It's what you hoped life would be. And that's the spiritual dimension of life. Yeah. And then above that, you have the transcendental dimension of life, which is actually beyond the dhyanas. But that's how Buddhism sort of configures the mind, that you have psychology at the base level, so to speak. Above that, you have a spiritual world, accessible through meditation in particular, but not just that. One of my deepest spiritual experiences was walking to the loo after a meditation. It would have to happen like that for me. I'm from a small English town, you know, you couldn't do it in meditation, you have to be on the loo. Anyway, you know, so that was a spiritual experience in that central way. It was I experienced myself radiantly alive, pulsating with life, and that the life around me and my own life were unified. Yeah? So that's a spiritual experience. And to see, if you haven't got a concept like this, you think you haven't got that. You've just got psychology and sort of sorting out your psychology. But you've got this spiritual realm, which we often disavow. I'll say more about that next week. And then above that, you've got a transcendental realm, yeah, which I'll talk about next week, because they're all too big, these words. Yeah. So that's the Buddhist vision: psychology on the base, on the top of that, spirituality on the top of that, the transcendental. If you were to grow in the most healthy way, you would grow up through those three levels. You would grow, your psychology would grow in a sense that you'd become more and more psychologically healthy, integrated, unified, happy, non-conflicted, non-neurotic, etc. Yeah, you'd grow, as it were, from the bottom up. Yeah? You'd grow into a sort of healthy. Bhante Sangha actually calls it a healthy, happy human, which sounds a bit trivial, but it means someone who's all right. Yeah, they're all right. They're not in weird conflict with themselves. They're not in weird conflict with others. They don't hate themselves. They don't get into all sorts of weird sort of polarizations with their own experience. They're not racked by guilt, for instance, and so on. Yeah, and many of us, including myself, have work to do at that level, of becoming psychologically healthy. Above that, you have the spiritual level, and then above that, you have the transcendental level. And the healthiest way is to grow from the ground up. So there's two things I want to say about that before I say about breaking through. Gosh, I haven't the time. Breaking through psychology. One is that, and I'll say more about this, is to see that if you think like that, you have the danger of infinitely extending your psychology. Because when you try to work at being more psychologically happy and unified and less neurotic and less conflicted, you tend to find more and more stuff that needs to be worked with. So you can infinitely extend psychology. Yeah? So that's one danger of that picture, and that's the one I want to particularly stress tonight. The other side, which is usually an issue for people further along in their meditation life, is that some people have very spiritual experiences, some people even have transcendental experiences, and either that drags up the level of psychology that they haven't attended to, and that's not uncommon, where people have very strong experiences which they then can't integrate. Their sense of themselves is actually too narrow, and they've had an experience that is too big for it. And then they often get you have to go back down through those steps, back down to psychology. And I've met people who've done that. You also get people who can go very deep, but it's very narrow. Yeah. So what can happen is you try and bypass psychology. And this is a particular danger for anyone, like I am at the moment teaching, or especially online and so on, is you can emphasize your spiritual or even, dare one say it, transcendental experiences, and try to bypass the simpler but just as important psychological issues. Yeah? So, more recently it's been called, in the US particularly, spiritual bypass, yeah? Where you have a touch of something, spiritual or even perhaps touching onto the transcendental, and you identify with that, and you sort of try and get around your actual behaviour, your actual psychology, and that's very unhealthy. Yeah? So on one hand, you can infinitely extend psychology. On another hand, you can try and avoid it, and become a guru, which is very, very bad for you, and it's not actually very good for anybody else either. But it's very easy to do that in a certain sort of way with certain temperaments, especially in a westernized culture that's already very, it's very literal-minded, it's very left-brained, to use Ian McGilchrist ideas, it's very analytical, abstracted, deracinated, denatured, and all those sort of things. Yeah? Especially in that context, it's very tempting to grasp onto sometimes an idea of spiritual experience and even transcendental experience and try and use that to get around psychological issues that you need to work with. Yeah. So you see there's those two dangers. So it's worth bearing in mind that with everything else I want to say, if I can get a chance to say it. So this matter of infinite I want to just touch on. So every aspect of Buddhist practice genuinely, if you take it up genuinely, has an infinite dimension. Yeah? So when you do the Maitreyabandhu practice, the cultivating of love and kindness, you never get to the end of that. You can never say, basically got that. Universal loving kindness, thumbs up emoji, move on to the transcendental. You never can do that. Same with the mindfulness of breathing. You never get to the end of mindfulness of breathing. It's not something you do. It's interesting, the word perfect comes from the Latin perfectus, which means completed. It means done with. Yeah, that's why there's no notion of perfection in Buddhism. I mean, it's sometimes used, but it's used really rhetorically. Perfect, it used to be capitalized to represent the hidden deity, but it means completed and done with. I can't think of hardly anything in life that's completed and done with. Yeah? You never complete loving kindness, you never complete mindfulness. You never become a mindfulness expert, and if someone tells you they are, I'd suggest blowing a raspberry, but that's probably a bit rude, so perhaps we shouldn't do it. I was going to talk about something else, but I won't. Okay, let's give you an example of this infinite degree. So, on one hand, you can infinitely get more and more loving and understand that more and more deeply. You never can get to the end of that. It would be ridiculous, wouldn't it? You could never say you've got to the end of that. Now, in another practice of Buddhism, a bit quick to try and bring this in, but that is reflecting on the three lakshanas. Who's heard of the three lakshanas? So I get a sense of how much I need to say about it. Not very many of you. Okay, good. So the three lakshanas, this is far too big a subject to bring in. Look that one up. Google it. The three lakshanas are called the three marks of conditioned existence. So they're the reflection, and in insight meditation, Vipassana meditation particularly, you reflect that all things are impermanent. You not only reflect that all things are impermanent, you try to see directly in your experience, moment to moment, that is the case. You don't tell yourself all things are impermanent. You look to see if that is true. And in these reflections, you do that all the time, yeah? Especially in meditation, but also outside of meditation. When you do that, life changes. Yeah. Then you reflect that all things in conditioned existence are unsatisfactory. They won't give you ultimate satisfaction and bliss. Yeah, and you try to see if that's true just now. So you look at your experience in meditation. Is that true? Is there anything in my experience that's satisfactory, fully satisfactory? Even in the pleasurable parts of my experience, is that completely satisfactory or not? Again, you don't tell yourself, you just try to explore. This is called the Lakshana reflection, and this is what you'll do when you take up Vipassana practice, if you use it, if you think of it like that. And then the third Lakshana is that all things are devoid of true selfhood. They're anatta, they have no essence. There's no essences. That's why Buddhism doesn't believe in God, because it doesn't believe in you either. It doesn't believe in any essence. Yeah, it doesn't believe in any things. Buddhism hasn't got a place for things. As soon as we make something into a thing, even a very big thing like God, we have gone away from the truth, because there is no things. So the insight of anatta, insubstantiality, is to see there is no things. And again, you try to see if that's true in your experience. Is there anything that feels like a thing? Does it exist? Is that true? Is there a me here that is a thing that exists, that perdures through time, that I can rely on? Yeah, and you try to see that none of that's the case. That's what's called the three lakshanas. Now, this is really a wisdom practice. I'd rather use that language than Vipassana, because that can be misunderstood. It's a wisdom practice, and I'll say more about perhaps wisdom practices next week. But do you see that, again, you can start to think that you could get that. Okay, mindfulness of impermanence. I've actually even met people who think, I've got that. Done impermanence, I do see that everything's impermanent. Now, that will only be a conceptual sense. Yeah? If you really saw that, your life would change unimaginably. Yeah? But once again, it's this tendency, especially possibly for westernized people, to think that they've completed it, that they perfected it, that now I have that realization. Unfortunately, they're often talked about as insights, and insights are something you can have or not have. Do you see what I mean? Whereas actually, again, they have an infinite dimension. You can keep exploring your experience through the lakshanas, and your experience will keep opening up in new ways. Yeah. So the lakshanas have an infinite depth. They're not something you can just do. Just like Maitreyabandhu and loving kindness has an infinite reach. There's not something you can do. So that's fine. Everything is like that. It has this infinite dimension. When it becomes problematic is when you get stuck at a particular level. Yeah? So with the Lakshana reflections, you can get stuck at that level to think that you've actually done it. You've seen through the Lakshanas, you've got in with wisdom, and you can then teach it to everybody. You just got stuck at that level. Actually, there's much, much more than that. The Lakshanas aren't a description of reality. They're a description of how we get reality wrong. Yeah? They're not a description of how things really are. That's beyond any kind of description. In the same way, so that's one danger for people practicing spiritual life, is they get stuck at the level of the Lakshanas. Now, that's probably not a danger for you, so I probably should never have mentioned it. But it is a danger for... these things are becoming kind of commonplace, and it's important to clarify them. The more common danger is that we get stuck at the level of psychology. Yeah? That's by far the most common danger, and it's the common danger that I've seen around me. I see it quite a lot. So it's easy to get stuck at the level of psychology, yeah? Especially in a world where we think that's all there is. Now, I want to be a bit careful about this because actually, which is why my friends were laughing upstairs, I didn't do very well on this. So, I came along many, many years ago. I was very, very unhappy when I came along. Very depressed, actually, looking back on it. Although in those days you didn't hear depression talked about very much, but I was very, very depressed. I could be utterly charming or very depressed. And when I was depressed, I'd just hide. Luckily, I came here, and it was the first time I was able really to talk about that sort of thing, and many other things. Anyway, I took up the practices that we did, and looking back on it, I didn't try and sort of spiritually bypass, but what happened is that I've always been troubled by lack of self-esteem. Sorry to be so personal, but sometimes it's best to talk directly. I've always been troubled by lack of self-esteem. Even when I was a child, I was always upset. I was always unhappy. I have all these family photographs of all my three brothers smiling, my sister grinning, and me crying. And I came to think that I was just not very good at happiness, basically. Some people can scuba dive. Some people are good at happiness, some people aren't. What's the big deal? I began to think that that my tendency to be unhappy, which was very, very marked and carried on for a long, long time, was like having a sort of, club foot or something that, it means I wouldn't be able to go running, but I could get through a day all right. And that is basically how I treated it for a long time. Mainly because I really didn't think it was resolvable. Anyway, quite recently, I can't remember when I did it, but I did go to therapy. I went to have CFT. It was very embarrassing because I was a member of the College of Public Preceptors. I was ordaining people by then. I was Mr. Spiritual Chops, so to speak. So it was very, very humiliating to realise that there were still issues of self-esteem. Self-esteem is very complex. I won't take questions now. I'll catch it. Self-esteem is complex because it shows up in very odd ways. You can have self-esteem issues and it shows up in overworking. You can have self-esteem issues and it shows up in showing off and trying to get lots of attention. And you can, it's actually much more complex than it sounds. Anyway, so I did have to go all the way back to working directly with self-esteem, very late on, not very late in my life, I'm not that old, but, in my 50s. And basically I hadn't tried to kind of bypass it. I just genuinely thought, I just couldn't do anything with that. I'd had therapy in the past, I'd tried all sorts of things, I just found it made it worse. My experience with therapy was that I had a better understanding of why I was unhappy, but I was just as unhappy. And I just didn't seem a good enough result. So I just thought, look, I'm just going to have to live with it, like a gammy leg, So I did have to go all the way back to psychology, and I'm very, very glad I did it, because you can change your self-esteem. It's actually not as straightforward as you think, at least not as straightforward as I think, and it does take quite a lot of practice. But you can change your self-esteem. It is very doable. And I can say that now because I have tricky times still, but generally speaking, my general happiness is better than it ever was. And I wish I had looked at that more earlier. I think, anyway, I won't talk too much about that. So I don't want to turn psychology into a sort of lower thing. That's the problem of psychology, spirituals, transcendental, is you think it's a lower thing and you should be beyond it. And I did feel that I should have been beyond it. Yeah, it was very humiliating to have to. I remember I did it on Zoom, and I can't remember, I think it was during lockdown or something. And this therapist, he was actually very good. He said to me, "Why? Can you say why you're here?" And I felt like saying, "Mind your own business." You know. And I thought, no, I literally am his business. You know. I mean, you couldn't be more literal. I literally am his business. But my strong sense was, wouldn't you like to know? Eventually, I had to apologise that I felt so reluctant. I had to say, look, I'm really sorry. I'm so unwilling to admit this. I found it very sort of shaming. So I don't want to sort of create that thing that psychology is something lower and that you shouldn't have it. We do need to work with our psychological conditioning, our psychological health. But we can get stuck in it. Yeah? And I have met lots of people, and weirdly, myself was stuck in it, and part of that stuck in it was not actually solving it, was not trying to do something about it. I just ignored it, and that was part of being stuck in it, if you see what I mean. And I've known people be stuck in it by going to endless therapy and talking endlessly about what they've discovered in therapy, because it has an infinite degree aspect. You can always unearth more things. So the danger becomes when we get stuck in it. And the great danger of psychotherapies and all sort of psychological approaches is that they encourage self-absorption. Yeah? If you're not careful, you get more and more self-absorbed. And then you feel bad about being self-absorbed, which makes you more self-absorbed. And then you think, oh my God, I'm doing that feeling bad about being self-absorbed thing, which is makes you more self-absorbed. And your friends say, you're a bit self-absorbed. I know, oh God. It's all about me, isn't it? Why? We're always talking about me. It's me all the time. Yes, you can never get out of it. You can never get out of that pattern. So I think partly it's because we don't have faith that there's something beyond psychology, spirituality and the transcendental. But also there's a strong narcissistic tendency in modern life. There's more and more of modern life, westernized modern life, is more and more, it seems to me, narcissistic, in the sense that it's preoccupied with me and how I feel. Before we know it, everyone has to conform to me. If I'm allergic to perfume, no one's allowed in the room to wear perfume. If I'm something, in other words, we're creating a society in which society has to fit around the individual, not the individual try and fit into society. Now that is impossible. What that will do is tear society apart, because you'll have more and more conflicting desires. Yeah, you need to realise that I'm like this, and you need to accommodate that. Somebody's then wanting the absolute opposite. To have a society, which is an incredible achievement really, to have even a half-pie working society like our own, because remember they can be destroyed and are destroyed again and again through history, violently destroyed. To have one at all is remarkable, and it means everybody needing to help that happen. You can't have it fit around yourself. And I feel I'm noticing that breaking down on a day-to-day almost basis now. Like, are you noticing that when you get off the tube now, more and more people aren't waiting for people to get off. There used to be a kind of etiquette, a mores, which said, you wait for people to get off and then you get on. It's fine, that works well. But gradually those kind of mores, those kind of internalized kind of etiquettes of how we live together are breaking down. I was interviewing someone who was saying that he's in LA and he says more and more people are driving through red lights. You notice more and more people eating on the tube, and no amount of posters saying "be kind" will help that. Don't want to say, "Oh, be kind." Never. Oh gosh. Of course, such a good idea. You need something much sort of deeper. So there's all this sort of a narcissistic, very strong narcissistic trend in Western society, and that's going to get us more and more involved in ourselves, in these competing needs. The thing I wanted to particularly draw out, because I do need to be controversial, because this is breaking through into Buddhahood. I can't be nice, can I? Otherwise it's like, what breaking through was that? It didn't even break through anything. The thing that I've been particularly struck by is this language of trauma. This is becoming very, very common now. Lots of people talking about trauma. Now, originally, the language of trauma came from people who've been in war zones, where they had experienced extreme trauma, and it's very, very debilitating. Luckily, I've never experienced anything like that. But that's where it originally comes from. But before we know it, we're getting that everybody has trauma, and we're getting even that you have generational trauma that's stored in the body. Now, I don't know, I've read a bit about it, and I've read a bit about the science. From what I've read, and I've not read that much, suggests that there's no real science in it. The idea that it's stored in your body, that's just a sort of myth, really. There's no real science in it. So I read anyway in a fairly respectable book. I don't know the truth of it. My own experience is there's something in it, actually. I've had experiences, even spiritual experiences, that seem to come out of my body. I remember very early on when I was meditating, I often found that my legs were very tense. And in one meditation retreat I was on, I was really trying to relax my legs more and more. You know how that when you just can't relax, really. My legs were very tense. And I relaxed and relaxed and relaxed them. And then suddenly I had this vision of being lowered into the bath, into a tin bath as a child. And when you try and put babies into the bath, they pull their legs up all the time. And it was like that. And in this sort of visionary experience, I just sort of let myself be lowered into this bath, and then my legs really relaxed, and I had this kind of, this sort of spiritual experience, yeah. And it did seem to come from my legs. So I can see how the idea of it being sort of held in the body, there's something in that, in my experience. It's just that we can get stuck at that level. That, just see how if you're not careful, it feeds back into a kind of narcissism. That everything is to do with, now I've got trauma. We must be careful with these strong words. My mother saying, "What's the matter now?" is not a trauma that I went through. It's just that I was a miserable child. It was a bit upsetting, but she didn't mean anything by it. It wasn't a trauma. Yeah, we must be careful of sort of extreme language to describe everything, because then everything becomes meaningless. It's like if we say everything's red, then the word red is meaningless. If we call everything a trauma, then the word is actually meaningless. We've destroyed it. So as I say, I think there's something in this idea that there's this book, isn't there, The Body Keeps a Score, which I haven't read, but it's hugely popular, and I'm a bit interested by why it's so popular. If we're not careful, it fits into this abyss of self, where we discover, just when we thought we'd got through childhood trauma, we now have generational trauma that's to do with my ancestry in the body and so on. It's a highly suspect idea. Yeah, there is something in it, but if you're not careful, it'll keep us at the level of psychology. It'll kind of bring us back again and again to the great matter of me. And there's something in that of value, but if you're not careful, it creates self-absorption. And self-absorption is not in your interest. When you diagnose people with depression, the primary symptom is self-absorption. That's what they mostly present with, yeah? That they can't stop thinking about themselves. They can't stop questioning themselves, double questioning themselves, questioning their questionings and so on. Yeah? And the idea of trauma, if you're not careful, will feed into that. Now that's understandable if we don't have something above and beyond that, a spiritual realm, a transcendental realm. But that's one way, I think, of talking about breaking through psychological conditioning. We need to, if we can, grow from the base. We need to become happier and healthier and more unified, but not infinitely extend that. Not keep on coming back to that as if that's all there is. It's not actually healthy. A lot of growing up is realizing that there are other people in the world apart from you. You know, when I was a child, if I was having a big meltdown on the bus, my mother would say, there are other people on this bus as well as you. She wouldn't empathize with me. She'd say, there are other people on the bus here. And I would stop. And that is what she should say, yeah. But if we're not careful, nobody will say that anymore. Everyone has to empathize. See last week. But hopefully you grow from psychology, you get healthier, but then you open up to spiritual experiences, which are also, they're experiences that are rapturous and opening. Then you open to transcendental experiences, which are beyond that. How spiritual and transcendental experiences appear in the world as you become more and more concerned with others. You become more and more aware of the needs of others and less preoccupied by yourself. What we mean by a healthy person is someone who's okay in themselves, so much so that they're just interested in others. Yeah? And they're aware of them, they can empathize with them, they can challenge them, they can talk to them, they want everybody on board, they want us all to have a good time. It's not the abyss of self. Yeah? That's really what psychological health is. And we must be careful of modern trends that keep on turning us back to ourselves as if that is always the answer. And that will get you into an infinite regress.